Morning. Good morning, good morning. This morning we're going to look at Ephesians. We've been going through Ephesians, and let's double check here. Yep, everything looks good. There we go. Oops. Let's go back. Before we get to the rest of chapter 2, I wanted to go through, and I mentioned this last week, that we need to talk about, maybe I'm just a little stuck on that word apocalypse, but I think it's important because that's what Paul is praying for in the previous chapter, and he mentions it several times. And so I've sort of titled this section, The Apocalyptic Power Alliance, maybe because it sounds good, but that power alliance that Paul wants to tell us about is a big feature in Paul's diagnosis of the human condition. So let me just read chapter 2, verses 1 through 3 again. And this morning I want to broaden out. Normally I would laser focus just in the text and get the context and those sorts of things and not branch out and to make it a big lesson. But this morning I'm going to do that. Let's just read again. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. And you were dead in y'all's trespasses and sins. If you'll notice, I changed it because it is the second person plural in the Greek. We don't have that, of course, anymore in English, the second person plural. But and y'all were dead in your trespasses, and you were in which y'all once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of our body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love which he had for us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. And raised us up with him, there's that resurrection thing again, and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. All right, so let's go back to the first part. I want to talk this morning about the prince of the power of the air. Because before we can talk next week about how Jesus destroys the enmity, is the word that's used in some translations there. The enmity that is between man, right? What's the whole problem in Ephesians? What's he writing about? This ethnic division, what we might call even a racial division today. I don't like the word race, so I use the word ethnic. This ethnic division. And so before we could talk about how Jesus is going to destroy the enmity between men, between mankind, before we could talk about how he's going to destroy those powers, we have to know what those powers are and what they are capable of. So, in chapter 2, he sort of starts off by saying, before you were created as new humans, right? While you were still dead, those things, right? You were walking. Y'all were walking. Y'all were walking in step according to, at one time, you were walking in step with the age of this world. And we recognize the language there that Paul is using, right? From this age. Do you remember of course, I was going to put it in there and I didn't, our overlapping Venn diagram of this age and the age to come, where we can often insert the earth and heaven or the new heavens, new earth, whatever we want to call it. The age of this world isn't just terrible for no reason. Why is this age so terrible? And the answer is because he tells us back in chapter 1, we are enslaved. This world is enslaved, and the world itself is walking in step with the ruler of the air, he says, the authority of the air, of the spirit who is now working in the sons of disobedience. Notice that what Paul has in mind is this specific figure. This is not just some nebulous little demon thing flapping through the clouds, right? Paul has a specific personal figure in mind. And I also want to point out that nowhere else, Elizabeth, not so crazy, okay? Thank you. Try and keep it down. I also want to point out that that phrase, the prince of the power of the air, doesn't appear anywhere else in the Bible, okay? So we need to think about who these things are. The authority of the air. It's like the air you breathe. Neo, over here. Over here. Thank you. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It will be fine. Okay? Let mom handle it. Thank you. All right. The authority of the air, like the same air that we breathe. Do you remember in chapter 1, he says, where is it at? Where was I going? I didn't write it down. Of course, I wrote chapter 1, but I didn't write the actual verse down. Give me 1 second. Yeah, all right. So Jesus, where is he at? He's enthroned. He's seated above all things, right? Things that are in heaven, things that are on earth. He's seated above all rule and power and authority. So Paul is envisioning that there are institutions, whether they're spiritual or human rulers in those institutions, that there are things that structure my understanding of reality, and they're in the air that I breathe. I realize this is a very abstract concept. It's something that I breathe, right? Of course, this is, what's the word I'm looking for? Overlaps with the very word that we translate as spirit, right? Which in the Greek is pneuma. Pneuma meaning breath or wind, right? So the word spirit is breath in Paul's language, right? So we're breathing, we're inhaling, we're exhaling something that we don't even see, and that thing determines or influences what we think. That thing influences how we feel, what we value, what we desire. That's what Paul's trying to get at here. And that thing has authority, and it's some kind of personal being, right? Isn't AI wonderful? I plugged in the first 3 verses of Ephesians chapter 2 there, first 3 verses that we just read, and it spit out this picture. Google Nano Banana is actually pretty good. And it actually spells everything correctly, too. I had a big problem with Microsoft's AI picture generation thing. So this idea of something powerful in the air that we breathe that can take control over us is a part of Paul's worldview that is very important. I realize it can be very abstract to us, children of the Enlightenment, the last several hundred years that have been taught that nothing exists out of what is visible, outside of what is visible. But what do we know about these powers? Let's see if we can put together a picture of what's going on here. Because we know that they are subordinate to Christ, right? He just said in chapter 1, right? Because why? Because he's seated above them, right? Yay, everything's taken care of, right? No power whatsoever, right? Well, that's not what he says here in chapter 2. Not so much. He says here in chapter 2, so apparently, even though Christ is seated above them, they are still enslaving and taking captive large groups of humanity. And the only way out of it, Paul says, is in apocalypse. A sudden realization of something. What is that something? We'll get to that at the end. But I want us to think about how Paul's first century vocabulary and his worldview come together, and I want us to try and understand what he means when he says the spiritual powers or the powers of the air, like we're talking about here. So let's broaden our scope and look at some of the other letters of Paul and maybe even some of the Hebrew scriptures to see if his definition, Paul's definition, matches our own definition, right? Because as modern people, we tend to assume that those ancient people thought that they thought of those principalities and powers, and they believe in them in the same way that we think of and we believe in them. But sometimes we think of these powers as literally maybe little red men with a pointy tail, horns on them, maybe, or maybe some invisible demon flapping around in the sky. And maybe that demon occasionally targets somebody, this unlucky person, with a terrible load of disease or lust or passion or death or cancer or something that leads to death. Sometimes we have these ideas of what Satan is and what the devil is. And we often think that the ancients let me back up. When we think of the ancient folks like that, we can begin to read the Bible with that sort of lens. And what I mean is, when we see words like spiritual or spirit, we often take that to mean non-material things, right? Non-material entities. Metaphysical maybe is a better word. And so when we read these ancient accounts of these encounters with these powers, like Paul is talking about here, sometimes we only see them as maybe a dream or a hallucination because there's no real physical properties to them, right? And what I'm saying is that these beings are very much real, even if we can't, and our minds are being held captive, so we can't see them physically. Because our eyes and our mind are captive to a way of seeing and thinking that can only regard those demons or angelic powers as invisible, and they're only invisible versions of people like ourselves, or maybe a fantasy or some sort of dragon or something. And there is what is sometimes called a gulf. There's a large space between us and the biblical writers historically of what they were thinking. And so when we use the same words but project them onto medieval constructs of dragons and those sorts of things, we're doing ourselves a disservice, is what I'm trying to say. If our goal is to understand the New Testament and Paul's writings, especially here, and his conception of what the powers are, then we have to pay attention to his own unique vocabulary and the concepts of the first century, right? To try and grab onto what he means so that we can see what it meant to him, not what it means to me through the lenses of some medieval author that I'm reading. Because oftentimes that's what happens to us. So my point is that it's dangerous and it's even arrogant to to not believe in something just because something exists outside of our current categories, our limited categories. Just because it's ancient does not mean that the idea is primitive, right? We tend to assume today that progress and technology means progress and understanding, right? We tend to think technology will have understanding, right? I have the entire world in this little brick here, but that doesn't mean I have understanding, right? It doesn't mean I have wisdom. So progress and technology does not mean progress and wisdom. It does not mean insight into the meaning of life or how things really operate. Do I have more insight into the meaning of life because of this right here? No. So progress and technology does not mean, my point is, these ancients and how they thought is not necessarily primitive. Elizabeth, go sit with mom, please. Thank you. It's the ultimate deception for us. The ultimate deception is to think that the rest of human history is just yesterday's news. That Paul and the biblical authors, they were able to see the world, but they were just blind. We can really see the world now. And so these characters, the powers character, appear in almost all of Paul's letters, right? And for Paul, that helps him understand much of what he sees happening all around him on an individual level, in a corporate level, in a political level, in an economic level, in an ethnic level, between people, our fellow men. The powers influence how I see my fellow man. And so sometimes we are blind. My whole point here is that we are blind to the forces that determine our own lives. Can you imagine? Wait, go with me for a second here. You're an alien looking down on a big city, and you're looking for a place to land your saucer, and there's all these roads and all these cars that are on the roads. And they're all doing exactly what most of them are doing exactly what these signs tell them to do, right? What would I think about those signs in relation to the people or the cars? Those signs are controlling the people. They're doing exactly what it says on those signs, right? I want us to think now, leave that metaphor off to the side, but I'll come back to it every few minutes here. Sometimes we're blind to the forces that determine or put stumbling blocks in front of us, right? Paul really does have a character of beings that are flapping around. I don't know if they're flapping around or not, but they are real. And I don't know what you think of when you hear that concept of demons, but the way that Paul works this out is really sophisticated, and it totally bleeds into when we talk about political issues, when we talk about social issues, when we talk about economic issues and ethnic issues and spiritual issues. There is an overlap about how those beings, how those dark forces influence us like road signs telling us to go in certain directions. Because for Paul, he has this language to talk about those things. The influence that tells me that I shouldn't care about my fellow man, even though he stumbled and fell, because he's carrying the poster for the opposite political party. That I should laugh and make fun of him when he stumbles and falls, right? There's something inside of me that I never would have done that to anybody else except for that person in that situation. There's something controlling me. And so for Paul, that language he uses, he calls it the powers. And they're not material, they're not just human, right? But they're not just little winged creatures with pointy tails, right? Who give you bad dreams. When Paul saw the Roman centurions bossing people around, that was the powers. When he saw Christians dragged off to the gladiator arenas, that was the powers. When he saw Christians dividing their churches, like in Ephesians here, along the lines of ethnic lines, that was the powers. They were giving in to the powers. This really is a rabbit hole, and I don't know if we'll be able to get through all the slides today, but when Paul saw Christians dividing themselves along those lines, they were giving in to the powers. All right, so let's look and try and deepen our understanding here of what the apostles were trying to do, especially Paul here. And let's just start with Ephesians, right? One was in chapter 1. I've already mentioned it here. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 20. I didn't ever give the verse, I guess. But talking about the immeasurable power of greatness of his power towards us who believe, according to the working of his great might, that he worked in Christ when he raised him from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenlies. Heavenly places is translating one word that is plural. Far above all rule and authority and power and dominion. Keep those words in mind. Rule, authority, power, and dominion. We'll see at least 3 of those words appear in every letter that Paul writes. He seated Christ far above all rule and power and dominion, above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. So in chapter 2, we're then introduced to the ruler and the power of the authority of the air. We'll go back to him a little bit later. I just read that, so I won't read it again. But in chapter 3 now, Ephesians chapter 3, he's going to say that the mere existence of the church, of the people of God, the church doesn't even have to do anything, right? The church being the family of Abraham, those people who have been reconciled human beings, who live as one in the Messiah, the mere existence of that group proclaims God's wisdom to those powers. That's why Paul says in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 10 there, so that through the church, that's me and you, that's our job, the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to the rulers and the authorities in Washington, D.C.? No. In the heavenly places. That's that singular, that's that word again, that is plural. Single word that is plural. In the heavenlies. That means all of creation. It's our job to take that message, the manifold wisdom of God, the multifaceted wisdom of God, that gospel message out into the world. It's our job to take it into the heavenly places, into all of creation, to counteract the powers. That's what Paul says the job of the church is. So, I want you to think about the logic that's underneath that. So, if what this family is people whose identities, personal identities, divide them in the present age, right? Something that hinders unity. Then whatever creates unity is overcoming those powers, which means that the powers are things that divide people. So when we see people being divided in the world, when we look out, we see people being divided into groups that hate each other based on race, ethnicity, social economic status, whatever it happens to be, that's the powers, Paul says. And when we look at a list here in Galatians chapter 3, when we saw that list of, Paul tells us, where was that? Chapter 10. Sorry, chapter 10, chapter 3. He gives us a list of unity in the body of Christ in chapter 4. And he mentions several things. He mentions gender, he mentions ethnicity, he mentions socioeconomic class, he mentions slavery, he mentions freedom. And so now we can start to put together some of the ideas that he's talking about. Because they come to a climax at the end of the book in chapter 6, which is, of course, the famous what? Ephesians chapter 6, the armor of God. And none of this armor actually made out of metal, right? So they come to the climax in this is the fullest list that Paul gives when he's talking about the reason we put on these attributes of God himself is so that we can stand firm against the schemes of who? The slanderer. The slanderer, the devil. Because that's what that word means. It's a title, it's not a name. The word devil means slanderer. And then he says, listen, right? He says, after these things, he says, listen. Where are we at? Sword of faith. Right before that. Verse 12, chapter 6, verse 12. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against rulers and against authorities, against the cosmic powers of the present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in, man, there's that word again, heavenly places, in the heavenlies, in all of creation. It's not just up there, someplace far away from us, right? Our struggle is not against other humans, he says. It's other humans who drag you into the arena. Maybe Paul didn't get it. It was humans who are dragging people into the arena and throwing them to the lions. It's definitely other humans that might exclude you from the synagogue or from worship at the Zeus temple down the road, right? It is humans. Paul says, please don't mistake them for the actual enemy. They are not the actual enemy. They are captive to the powers. They are enslaved to the powers. And so the actual enemy are the rulers and the powers, that unique term, and especially the unique term here in chapter 6, this cosmokratotos, cosmo being cosmic, the cosmic grabbers, the grabbers of the cosmos, those who are grabbing after things that don't belong to them. The spiritual powers of evil in the heavenly places is how it's translated into English. And so there are these powers that are actively resisting the unity and the existence of this group called the church. These powers are actively resisting a group of people who do not allow their identity to be defined by something outside of their community. They don't allow their identity to be defined by politics, by economic policy, by ethnicity, by gender. And so in Ephesians, we get the sense that this is much bigger than an invisible little spirit guy who's putting a little greedy thought inside of my heart. This is a lot bigger than that if we need the armor of God to go up against it, right? So if you turn to some of Paul's other letters, I've got a whole list here, and for time's sake here, I'm not going to go through them all. We're going to zip through just a couple of them. Let's look at Colossians chapter 1, though. Colossians chapter 1. Romans, Corinthians, getting close. Oh, Philippians, Colossians, there we go. Colossians chapter 1, of course, we get this thanksgiving of prayer, and it talks about the creation of everything there in, well, as he's going down, verse 16. These preach out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel, the others proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition and not sincerely, thinking they will cause me trouble in my imprisonment. Back up at the introduction, it says that all things that were created in the Messiah, all things that are in heaven and things that are in earth, you see the apocalyptic design there of heaven and earth. He's revealing something to them. I'm in Philippians. That's why I can't find it. Let's try Colossians this time. I was like, why is this not making any sense? Colossians chapter 1, verse 16. For everything was created by him in heaven and earth, and visible and invisible, whether thrones and dominions. Oh man, that sounds familiar. Rulers and authorities. Yep. All things have been created through him and for him. So, just let me ask you, when he uses the word powers, does he only mean non-physical things? Let's read it again. All things that have been created in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, whether are thrones physical? They are. I mean, we don't have a throne here. Depends on who you talk to in politics. But we have a White House, right? They still have a throne in a couple different countries that they can look to. There's almost always a singular leader of a country that we can kind of put in that position. Everything that was created by him in heaven and earth, the visible and the invisible, the thrones, the dominions, the rulers and authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. So Paul is talking about physical things here. We're not talking about a little invisible demon flapping around in the clouds, right? He's not just talking about non-physical entities. The powers that Paul is talking about have both a physical manifestation, a visible manifestation, and there is an invisible power or dynamic that is behind them, right? The thrones, that's what I'm talking about here. Like whether we want to call it the Kremlin or the White House or Capitol Hill or Juno, right? We all use those interchangeably. These are actual thrones for Paul, and they are intertwined in the reality. Those spiritual powers are intertwined in the reality, kind of like when we talked about our chart. Remember that this age and the age to come, the problem is they're a Venn diagram. They overlap. And so we can participate in the age to come right now, but somehow we're still in this age. We'll get to that later, right? So Paul sees these powers, these cosmic powers. And of course, he is accused of being one of these people, right? I mean, how is the Jesus movement perceived by first century Romans and first century Jews? It was perceived as being one of these movements of people who are brainwashed by religious philosophers, right? These traveling teachers who are trying to make a buck off the latest version of Change Your Life Now. Like, we would think that if we're in this age of technology and reason, that we wouldn't have those things, but we're still knee-deep in get-rich-quick schemes and religious philosophies that are the newest thing that's going to change your life. But Paul sees the power of the cosmos there. And, of course, Paul is accused of being one of these traveling teachers, right? But I want you to see something interesting. Do you know what Jesus did when he died on the cross? What he claimed to do and be doing? He claimed to be stripping off the armor and the weaponry, the weapons of those rulers and authorities. That's what John chapter 12 says. I'll skip through it just for time's sake. But I'm pretty sure he still got killed by them, right? So by what mindset or what logic is Jesus' crucifixion, his crucifixion as a rebel criminal by the Romans, by what logic is that disarming them? How is that stripping them of their power and exposing them to public shame? Right? How does that strip them of their power? You see how Jesus is inverting what they meant by the cross into his own meaning now? Jesus was the one exposing. No. Jesus was the one exposed. No. Jesus was exposing them. The cross was actually the triumph over the powers. And so the cross is also the way that we are rescued from the present evil age, right? That's what John says. It's the way that we are rescued from being enslaved to those powers that he says were by nature not God's. That doesn't mean they're not powerful, though. But they are powers of the cosmos. So Paul is not the only one who thinks like this. I mentioned John already. You can turn to John and you can see that same earthly spiritual overlap that's going on in chapter 12. Because as Jesus is talking there in chapter 12, he's about to go into the upper room and he has this final conversation with the disciples. And he says, "Now is the judgment of the world. Now the ruler of the world is cast outside." And Jesus is thinking about his upcoming torture and then the cross and the resurrection. But just a few verses later there in chapter 12, in verse 42, he uses the same exact word to describe the rulers who believed in Jesus. Yes, there were rulers who believed in Jesus. So some of the chief priests, the military captains, Pilate in Jerusalem, some of those people believed in Jesus. But they're also the ones who are going to kill him. And so Jesus can describe what they're going to do to him as ultimately empowered by the ruler of the world. And there's that heaven and earth overlap again, right? Spiritual and physical overlap, the age to come and the current age. So these are created beings, entities, whatever you want to call them, that can serve God's good purpose, or things can go terribly wrong and they can rebel against God. And so Paul, who's going to be imprisoned by this point for much of the rest of his career, let me back up and say that differently. Paul is imprisoned for much of his career. He's imprisoned by this power and authority. And it's unjust. It's injustice. And he has a way to think about the powers not as inherently bad, but as easily corrupted. Kind of like just like humans are made in the image of God, but are so easily corrupted. Kind of like when we see that interplay in the beginning of Job between Satan and God. Something has gone wrong and he's rebelling. And 1 Corinthians 2 is an important passage to think about Paul and the rulers. Because the rulers are who crucified Jesus, right? Pilate, Caiaphas. They're what we would call real people. But when Paul is writing 2 Corinthians, this is at least 10 years after Jesus has died, right? And so Paul can talk like these powers still exist. Paul's point is that not every human and not every cosmic, spiritual, whatever you want to call it, structure of authority that is governing human existence right now, not every structure will have to be destroyed to make way for this new creation. His point is, here, let's read what we're talking about here. We speak of wisdom among those who are mature, a wisdom, however, not of this age, nor of the rulers of this age, who are passing away. Rather, we speak of God's wisdom, the mystery or the open secret, which has been hidden, which God predestined before the ages for our exaltation to glory, a wisdom that none of the rulers of this age understood. For if they had understood it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So maybe we need another way to think about this. And I don't have a bunch of time to get into Romans chapter 8 this morning, but I want to just mention it real quickly here because I'm already gone long. Let's try and put some of those puzzle pieces together from Ephesians and Colossians and 1 Corinthians, and now in that famous passage from Romans chapter 8. In the climax of Romans chapter 8, Paul asks us a question, or he says, who will separate us from the love of Christ? Will tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Who are the source? Let me ask you a question. Who are the source of most of those difficulties? People, right? People have swords in their hand. People cause distress and persecution. People, most of the time, cause famines. People, human powers. I can't stop it. Romans chapter 8. Let me just turn there real quick. Let me just read 35 through 39. Who can separate us from the love of Christ? Can affliction or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword, as it is written? And here he's going to quote from the Psalm 44. Because of you, we are being put to death all day long. We are counted as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any created thing will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen. He did the timeline, right? He did present and he did future. And now he's doing cosmos, up and down, the powers up there and down here, right? Anything that has been created. Do you see what he's doing there? Everything that humans are capable of and everything that these cosmic powers are capable of. And look what all the ideas joined in his mind here. The powers, death, physical rulers, they're all a part of the same thing. And so in Paul's logic here, in what we would call the rhetorical logic, the rhetoric that he's using here, rhetorical logic of Paul, is that no creature in God's world, it doesn't matter how rebellious they are or hostile to God's purposes, no creature can overpower the divine love that God has expressed by the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And those hostile powers include human violence, right? And opposition. But also, they correspond to those cosmic powers that are responsible for suffering and death on a cosmic scale, on a corporate scale, on a structural level, right? Notice that those cosmic powers, they're always called creatures. What's the root word of creatures? Create. They have been created, right? That is, they have a proper role in God's world. But they have rebelled against that role. And they have attempted to separate people from God, from the Messiah. Here he calls him the Christ. That word Christ and and it is the untranslated Greek form of Messiah, right? And so the Messiah's heavenly rule is to unite us. And Paul says that all powers in heaven or earth, remember in Colossians, the one I couldn't find, all powers are placed under his rule. And so Jesus has power now. Those same powers that created those speed signs, remember the signs that we were talking about? We're an alien, we're looking down, all those signs, man, those signs must really control the people. Now imagine that you had control of those signs. Would you have control over people? Yeah, right? You could direct where they were going. That's the metaphor I'm making with the way that the powers, whether you want to call them demons or devil, whatever you want to call them, influence our world. Those same powers that created those speed signs can be corrupted, and they can begin to create structures that are dehumanizing. Has a government ever created a structure or allowed a structure to exist that was dehumanizing? Yes, we have lots of examples. The big black mark of slavery on our own culture is one of the big ones. They can create structures that crush human beings, or even to say that certain types of human beings, they're not allowed to flourish here. You know, my people, the ones that look like me, yes, but not the other ones. For Paul, that is the influence of the powers. They have changed the road signs so that everybody thinks that it's normal because it's at the government level. And so if God doesn't recreate those people in Messiah Jesus, in Jesus Christ, you are enslaved to those powers. If you this morning have not been recreated in Jesus, if you have not been put into the water of baptism, into the grave, so that you can come up just like Jesus came up. That's the imagery that Paul uses there in Romans chapter 6, just a few chapters before, right? You have died, you have come up out of the water, a new human being, he says. If you haven't done that, you're still enslaved to those powers. They determine your life, your existence, your desire, even your own identity. And so for Paul, the enslavement to these powers is the standard human condition away from the Messiah, away from Jesus. It's the human condition. It's death and destruction. The word sin is in the language there, the famous duo, sin and death, right? In the letter of Romans, it's used so often. Sin can reign like a king over us, like a power over us. And it's a really big deal to Paul. Paul has got this really robust vision of what it means to be enslaved to the powers. So where did he get that idea? We don't have time this morning, but where did that idea come from? Well, it's part and parcel of how Jesus and the Old Testament scriptures present the reality of the world in light of those powers. Jesus did it. The Old Testament does it. We don't have time this morning, but we just did a study in the Hebrew Scriptures of spiritual beings, right? Next Sunday, we'll jump into the second half there of Ephesians chapter 2, starting in verse 11. And we'll look at how Jesus destroyed the enmity, the hostility between humans, the hostility between the powers and us. How he destroyed them so that we could be united together, horizontally and vertically, cosmically with God. You see that? He destroys the enmity. The whole point he wrote it in Ephesians was that the Jews and the Greeks were not getting along. Same thing with Galatians and Colossians and the other ones, right? The reason he wrote that was because they weren't getting along, because there was a disunity in the community. influenced by the powers. Jesus does away with that hostility because he has power now. We can have access to that power now. We can become new humans now if you will submit yourself in faith and trust and believing allegiance to him. You will put your trust in your entire life in his hands. If you will take off the old man, like it says in Galatians, and put on the new Jesus in baptism. That's what he says. Put off the old man, put on the new man in baptism. You too can become a part and have hope in that new age, that age to come. That's the lesson this morning from Ephesians. Next week, we'll look at the second half of chapter 2. It's good to have everybody here this morning. Let's grab our songbook and